present world is dominated really by two major forces. One is the legacy of neoliberal economic approaches, which in particular brought us, in my view, to the crisis of 2008. And the second is the rise of xenophobic populism in recent years. And both of these are relevant to post-democracy, but in rather complex ways. For me, the most important aspect of the financial crisis was that it was the result of a deregulation of the global financial system. And this deregulation was the result of very, very heavy lobbying on, in particular, the American government and then later other governments. And for me, that is part of post-democracy, is when enormous political influence and power goes to certain very privileged sectors of the economy. So for me, the economic crisis happened partly, at least partly, because we'd already been in a very post-democratic tendency. The second great force of today, xenophobic populism, is a more complex issue because to some extent one has to see it as an example of people rejecting post-democracy. It's an example of forces coming out of parts of the population which have caused problems for governing elites. But I see within xenophobic populist movements tendencies that are very hostile to democracy itself. In particular, these are policies of exclusion based on anger, based on hatred, and eventually that undermines popular participation. People are becoming dissatisfied with the performance of liberal democracy. And one can understand that, I think, quite easily. What is more difficult to understand is why it's a particular form of rather intolerant anti-liberal sentiment that is leading this. That is the puzzle that we have to explain. For perhaps the last 40, even 50 years, there have been gradual victories for liberal ideas of various kinds. And I do not mean so much economic neoliberal ideas, but general liberalisation, a decline of the restraints on people that existed in earlier decades, liberation, for example, of sexual behaviour, the liberation of women from their previous subordinate roles, also changes in the relationship that people have with people from other nations, whether this is about immigrants or about cooperation with other countries. And obviously some people have not liked this. There are people with deeply conservative values, people who are perhaps hostile to foreigners, hostile to women having a prominent role in society. And they have largely been quite quiet about this. They've accepted it. And I think they may have accepted it because, in general, the system was delivering a decent life. In recent years, we've seen two things. The economic crisis of 2008, or financial crisis, which meant that no longer was the economic system delivering. For the first time since the Second World War, we had a really major shock to living standards. Then secondly has been the growing deterioration of relations between the West and the Islamic world. Partly an issue of large numbers of refugees, partly an issue of incidents of terrorism. So I think in two ways the liberal democratic world has stopped delivering economically, and it stopped delivering security. And so conservative people who for a long time had suffered in silence said, right, now we're angry. Right? And they're expressing their anger. And I think this explains why, though the financial crisis was it's a problem of capitalism, capitalism is not being blamed. It's being blamed onto liberalism. It's being blamed onto Islamic people. It's being blamed onto Europe. Because it's not that these things actually cause the problem, but they are symbols for very conservative people of why their world is not as good as they thought it was. So I think there's a deep kind of pessimistic nostalgia about these new movements. At first, the rise of new social media and the role of the internet seemed to give an enormous breath of fresh air and renewal to democracy. Groups all over the world could begin to express themselves. They were not dependent on being published by big media organizations. It became easier to find out facts. It became much easier to organize campaigns and demonstrations. So there was an extraordinary liberation came through new media. But then as the years have passed, something else has happened, which is actually a pure example of post-democracy. And that is that some very large corporations and also some extremely wealthy individuals and groups have been able to take control of parts of the media. And we saw this in both the Brexit election, the referendum in Britain, and we saw it in the Trump election in the United States. It's possible for groups to distribute very large numbers of social media messages, carefully targeted on individuals, that give the impression that they have come from a multiplicity of sources, but in fact they've only come from one or two sources. And that has enabled extremely wealthy interests to manipulate opinion. And I call it a pure example of post-democracy because in post-democracy, it looks as though everything's functioning democratically. It's just that it's become a kind of empty game. And this way in which wealthy interests can manipulate social media is a perfect instance of that. It looks as though there's lots of things happening, but actually it's being tightly controlled. So sadly, the internet and social media, which started as a great liberation, they still play that role, but seems to be becoming overwhelmed by the capacity of the very wealthy to take control of it. If people do not know that their social media are being manipulated in this way, so there's an enormous education task there, which I think is beginning in schools. Children are being told now, look, that what you think is your friends communicating with you may not be your friends at all. In order to understand populism, we have to look at it at different levels. At one level, it is simply a question of new groups trying to enter an existing political system. Because existing political parties believe they have a kind of monopoly of legitimate political expression. It's very difficult for new groups to enter that. And if they do, they have to be disruptive. So at one level, populists are simply people, new people, trying to enter an old political system. Then we say, well, yeah, but what are they trying to do? What do they want? And the purest case of populism, historically, has been where the movement claims to have no actual agenda. They just say, we are the voice of the people. And we don't have any particular policies. We just respect the people's views. And in a way, Movimento Cinque Stelle in Italy is a perfect example of that, or was, in that it formed its policies through crowdsourcing. So that kind of pure populism is a strange beast because it seems to want to be engaged in politics, but for no particular purpose. And one then suspects, I think, one then says, well, is this just people wanting to become politically powerful? And therefore they'll do whatever it takes to do that. And they don't care what it is they end up doing. So that's one set of problems. Then there's another set of problems where populists say, we understand the will of the people. We express the will of the people. And therefore, we don't actually need to consult the people very much because we know what the will of the people is. And it's a singular will. Therefore, minorities are not the people. If you are not part of our movement, you are not people. So we have a singular will of a people. Therefore, we don't need debate and discussion. We just go for what we want to do. Now, that then immediately becomes anti-democratic because it says time for debate is finished. We are now the movement, and we know what the will of the people is. And That can be of the political right or the political left. In Latin America, it's tending to be of the political right, of the political left. In Europe, it's tending to be much more of the political right. And then you find movements that want to manipulate opinion in that way, usually try to find minorities that people can hate. And a very major aim of the politics then is to say, we are the people who represent the majority people, and we will help you deal with the problem of these minorities that we think you should hate. And that then, of course, becomes extremely ugly. So it's only when populism reaches that form that big alarm bells should sound. The other forms of populism, I think we just ask them, what do you really want? What are your policies? Right? So if you say you're a new group, and if you go to Podemos in Spain or to Syriza in Greece, who are populist movements, they have an answer there. They say, we want to put our economy on a different basis. I mean, they're not trying to make it, we hate people. They're trying to get some policies that the existing parties wouldn't accept. So one says, okay, yeah, right, you're a new party. We don't say you're a problem for democracy. You are a new expression of democracy. The crucial difference is not between left and right populists, as to whether a populist movement is seeking to close off debate once its prominent leaders have got some kind of power. When they start saying, we represent the will of the people, and people who disagree with us are not really part of the people, then it doesn't matter whether on the left or the right, they're becoming enemies of democracy. Because democracy means you always go on discussing. You must always have the expectation that today's minority might become a majority. And both majority and minority must accept that. So that's one sort of form of populism. Other forms of populism that are simply new groups saying, look, we think this time this system was opened up and new voices were heard, then that becomes different. And I don't see why people should criticise them or regard them as problems for democracy. I think a crucial issue is how clear and publicly understandable are the motives and the policies of a movement. So I think we can contrast here the Gilets jaunes in France with the Extinction Rebellion movement that's just sprung up, especially among very young people. The Gilets jaunes seem to be extremely diffuse. If you look at the slogans they leave on walls around Paris, some of them are demanding the restoration of the French monarchy. Others are demanding a better minimum wage. So that the entire spectrum of protest politics is there. There's also a violent edge to it. And one asks, who are these people? Is this a large number of groups coming together to take advantage of an opportunity to disrupt? In which case one says, before I know how I feel about this movement, I need much more clarity as what its central aims are. The Extinction Rebellion group are very clear. They are trying to save the planet from climate change. And they have some very clear ideas about the reduction of carbon emissions. Very practical ideas, actually. And they're a very disruptive movement. They've just done some marvellously disruptive protests in London. They are absolutely clear about their demands, actually. So I think there is a big difference with protest movements. How much do we understand? How much can we understand of what they want? The more clear that a movement's objectives are, the more it can be a participant in democracy, because democracy needs clear understanding and knowledge. If it's very diffuse and it's moving all sorts of different ways, then it's potentially dangerous for democracy, because this is just disruption in the end. And we don't know whether we want to support it or not, because we don't know what it's saying. The great achievement of 20th century democracy was to use the deep sentiments that people had about their nation and their identity with their nation to create a democratic force around the government at that level. So nation-state democracy was both a rational achievement but also a deeply emotional one. That's now become inadequate because many of the important issues in the world, economic regulation, taxation of giant corporations, tackling climate change, simply cannot be done at the level of the nation state alone. Therefore, democracy has to try to move beyond and above the level of the nation state. And this is extremely difficult to do because people's sentiments are so attached to that level. But the nation state itself was actually an artificial creation. People are not born with national sentiments. These are something that we've learned through national education systems, national cultural systems, national mass media. So therefore, a major challenge for this new century is, can we extend democracy above the level of the nation state? Can there be identities that people feel that go above that level? Not in order to replace national or local identities. This is an extra level, one on top of those. And I see two different approaches to that. First, and most ambitiously, we need to try to build actual levels of democracy above the nation state. And in Europe, we actually have the only example of that in the entire world. In the European Union, although it's very bureaucratic and people get frustrated by it, it has important elements of democracy. It has formal democracy in the European Parliament, but it also has informal democracy in the deep and frequent relationships between the Commission and European institutions on the one side, and employers' associations, trade unions, regional governments, local groups of many different kinds throughout European society. And so, for me, Europe has the only example in the world at the moment of something trying to get beyond national democracy. It's very easy to laugh at it because it's weak, but it's a very precious achievement, and I am extremely distressed by the fact that my country has chosen to try to rubbish that and walk away from it, and if possible destroy it. Secondly, regulation that happens at more international levels. If you look at institutions like the OECD or the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, it's very difficult, actually impossible, to see how you could actually govern them democratically at the level of the world. But we can do something less ambitious but quite practical. We could insert into our national political debates much more about the role of our governments in these organisations. So why you never get it in a national election campaign, you never get as an issue, why is our government behaving in a certain way in the World Bank? Right? It just doesn't take place, but it could. And what's fascinating is that these recent major protests by school children about climate change have been doing exactly that. They're saying we are demanding that our government plays a better role in these international talks and conferences. And it's extraordinary. This has come out of children aged between sort of 12 and 16. And they're because they're the citizens of the new century. And they are wanting politics and democracy to reach above the national level in this way of a national level debates about international issues and what international institutions can do. Because the European Union is actually very active in cultural issues at what we might call the level of high culture. Music, film, and also if you include in culture the whole world of academic research and science. And it's very interesting how it's at that level, people involved in those activities who are most likely to be very strongly supportive of the European Union. And in Britain, for example, overwhelming majorities of people involved in the arts and culture and science are very, very strongly supportive of membership of the European Union. About 90% of university teachers voted to remain in the European Union. So where Europe is able to be active at that kind of level, there are results. The difficulty comes in going to wider levels. And here, part of the problem, I suppose, is that in recent years, Europe has been dominated by a neoliberal economic agenda, which both means there's an obsession with economics and it means it's not interested in public spending. A second issue is that at the level of mass culture, we already have a global culture and it's an American one. Hollywood in particular, and also the American advertising industry, have been producing an almost global homogeneity of mass culture, food culture, cinema culture, music culture, that makes it very difficult for a specific European identity to be there. Education itself is of course deeply national in some respects, but it's not national in others. Science is neither national nor European. Science is global. When a scientist, natural scientist or a social scientist, and they write an article or a book, that contributes to a global level of knowledge. Knowledge doesn't recognize national or regional identities at all. It's a global human creation and is very precious for that reason. Education does seem to be becoming more instrumental everywhere. And it's partly because governments and corporations believe that education can play a major economic role. That the more educated the population is, the more productive it is as a workforce. Therefore, the more education, the better the economy you get. So therefore, you try to make education more purposefully related to the economy. And it's partly true. And it's partly those of us working in education who managed to convince governments that this was true. We then get depressed because they take that message too far. And they start to try to instrumentalize education, make it just about making workers more productive. This partly leads to a very narrow understanding of which subjects are economically relevant. And so there's enormous stress on engineering and the sciences, with an image still in mind of the manufacturing economy, where actually most growth in European and American economies at the present time is in services, for which often a more general education is more relevant. That people working in services often need social skills of a rather general kind, where a more general education is actually helpful. So part of the problem is that the very narrow notion of instrumental education is just wrong. That a general education might often be more economically productive than one that looks targeted. And this problem is particularly important in a country like Britain or the United States, where university students have to pay high fees. And they are told, yes, you've got to pay these high fees, but don't worry, you will get this back. Because if you have a good education, you will earn a lot of money. In order to justify that and make it true, they have to try and persuade students to study those courses that will lead to high earnings. So you want to encourage people who do things that will help them in the financial sector or to be lawyers. You don't want people to become art historians. Also, there's another problem, and that which in the end is perhaps the most interesting, and that is that the more we educate people, the bigger the proportion of a population that receives advanced education, the less it becomes true that there's an income return to education. The income return to education is a return to scarcity. And this is already happening. People say, well, I got my university degree, but I'm not getting a job any different from if I hadn't got a degree. And that's because so many have. Now, that can be a dreadfully self-defeating policy, because in the end people will say, well, I don't want education. It's not worth it, certainly if I have to pay for it. And so it's very important that people understand being educated isn't just about enabling you to get a good job. It's to enable you to have a richer life, to appreciate art and culture, to be able to function politically, to be able to be an intelligent citizen. And that, there's no value to be placed on that in money terms, but that is what you'll really get from your education, even if you don't earn more money from it. We need to revitalise general humane education that creates citizens. It's very interesting that I think in every country I've looked at the data for, this would be Italy, Britain, the United States, Germany, France, the people who vote for populist parties, or for example the people who voted for Brexit in Britain, usually have rather low levels of education. The higher the level of education, the less likely people are attracted to xenophobic movements. Because I think xenophobia and fear of foreigners is something that is more likely to happen among people who are generally fearful, because they find life difficult to cope with and difficult to understand. If we've had an education, even if we're not very wealthy as a result, we still feel, yeah, I understand something about the world, therefore the world is full of challenges, not of threats. And so I do not need to fear the fact that some people from Poland have lived into my street. I mean, this is not a problem for me because I can understand that. So I think education of all kinds tends to make people more easily able to accept change and to accept new things and strange things. And that's a very major thing. And another interesting issue is that, again, xenophobic movements tend mainly to attract old people. Old people are also, from generations, less likely to have had a high level of education. And also they are more likely to be fearful and feel they don't understand the modern world. So I think being able to understand the world, feel you can, even if you're angry about some things in it, you at least understand it and you feel you can cope with the future. That helps people not take up extremely intolerant attitudes and values. It's vital that children learn from quite early on that you should always question things, that you should always ask, why do we do this? Are there alternatives? Could we do things better? Authority has to be challenged always. This is difficult for school teachers, but the very best of them know how to encourage that. So education is about asking the question why, and then looking for good answers and trying to find answers. And that ability to ask the question why is obviously intellectually important, but it's also important to be a good citizen. The citizen should always be asking why.